You are now muted. You are now unmuted.
Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Beautiful. All right, we are on. We are recording. We are on and we are recording. Okay, both places are good. We will give it 5 minutes for some stragglers to get in here.
You are now muted.
seen that too? Yeah, that's all crazy.
You are now unmuted.
All right, can everybody hear me? Beautiful. Let's call roll. Jamie Beach. Jason Eater is here. Courtney Mag.
Here.
Sherelle. Tia. Alex. Shy. Shelly. Sydney.
Here.
Julia.
Here.
Aiden's here. Christina. Mark. Alex. Clark. Lucas. Max. Ella. Henry.
Here.
Dominique.
Here.
Ava. Stephen.
Here. Here. Ava's here.
Brooke. Sarah. Ari.
Here.
Druvy. Allison.
Here.
Dylan. All right, I have Allison, Druvy, Ari, Ava, Dominique, Ella, Aiden, Julia, Sydney, and Courtney Mag. Jason Eater also. If I did not call your name, I do not have you. Please speak up.
Here.
Who's here?
Shy.
Who?
Shy.
I think she's saying Shy.
Yeah,
Shy, are you almost dead? Or is that your internet? Okay, I see you. Let's go to 39. Okay, so this doesn't require much mentioning right now because we're almost done. But I've been pretty clear through the course that I don't schedule ride-alongs. Charleston County schedules ride-alongs. I give them access to our schedule. So if you put yourself available and they use a day that you said I'm available, then you're riding that day unless you take a 0. You can only take 1 0 and survive in the clinical category. So I don't recommend doing that. It puts you at an average of 75% in that category immediately. So please, I don't think this applies to many of you. There's only maybe 1 or 2 that will need an extra ride. But don't forget to be aware of what you've put on the calendar, because he may not even warn me before going into the calendar and selecting a day that you've marked yourself available. So please be sure that there's no day on there that you don't want on there. Okay? If you are finished with your rides, make sure you have a line through your name so that we do not aimlessly schedule you for more rides. Okay? Any questions for me before we begin? Okay. We will hold the module exam for special populations this week. The quiz for that was not grand for many of you, so please spend the work needed. Maybe that was a heads up for some of you to put some more time in the chapters and do some more adaptive tests, but it did not go well for some of you. And it was a large quiz, so when you tend to have 100 questions, then the expectation is that you're at least in the high 70s, 80s percentile, and that was not true for some of you. So I hope that was a little bit of an eyes open event, and you'll be fine for the module exam because you'll go study. That quiz is not quite ready to be set as a level 4. It will probably be so by the end of tonight. Some of you were able to review last week's lecture on Moodle, and some of you aren't. So it looks like to me that everyone who needed to submit a lecture assignment did, except for a couple stragglers. So if you need to do that lecture assignment, that is up on YouTube. And if you can't get access from Moodle, let me know, and I will get you access from the YouTube side of the fence. If you're keeping track, this is our last week together, which is crazy to think about, but I'm excited for you guys. You made it, and you did all the work, and I'm pretty happy that you're here. I'm proud of you all, and you're going to go out there, and you're going to be EMTs and do EMT things, which is kind of crazy. So congratulations on that. We're almost there. There will be no discussion post this week. There will be a quiz over the entire module of operations. We will conclude operations this week, and we will module exam it next week. So next week you do just have labs, Courtney. That is correct. Just have labs. So what we will do on Monday is I will potentially host a virtual assessment lecture or lab, or I will come down to the college. I don't know which one I'll be available for yet, so I'm going to figure it out. But worst case scenario, we just have labs next week. Any other questions? All right, let's quickly get into chapter 39, which we're not going to spend a ton of time on. I'm going to hit the highlights of it. This is not necessarily something that EMS as a primary role tends to do. However, there are many departments that have an extrication component. So it is very reasonable that you could go work somewhere that does, in fact, participate in, or maybe even serves as the primary on extrication and special rescue. Extrication means getting someone out of a vehicle would be common, even building extrication, and then special rescue would be stuff like high angle, confined space, swift water. That's what this chapter is about. It's a pretty technical chapter, so you're going to have to read it. It's not one that you're going to be successful with unless you read it. It doesn't get super in depth on each one of these things, but it does bring you an awareness of each one of these things. And so you need to, at a minimum, be aware of what classifies as a confined space, what classifies as a trench rescue, what classifies as a swift water event. Okay? So we're going to move quickly through this, and I'm just going to hit the things that I know you'll probably be seeing on the testing material. Because when you go work at an agency, if you're going to participate in any of these things, they will train you. So what you are reading this for right now is an awareness and a testing capability. This is not something that you would get hired on somewhere and we would just expect you to know. This is something we would put you specially through classes and courses and certifications to make you at the operational level for these things. So, vehicle extrication is one of the bigger things here. There's a lot of videos on YouTube about extrications and vehicle extrication. There's a lot of methods and talk and theology and religion that goes into all of that. And boy, are the people who do it really invested. I mean, they really like it. So if you're interested in it, it's on YouTube. You're probably not going to have a ton of time doing this as a primary provider. What I will tell you is that you cannot get in the middle or in front of extrication. You have to do one of two things. Wait until the patient is extricated, or you participate in a minimal treatment of the patient to sustain primary assessment findings until the patient is extricated. You cannot put yourself in an unsafe role here. Often when extrication is taking place, the vehicle is unstable. It may move, it could potentially still roll over. So whoever is the extrication resource is in charge of the safety component of that extrication. And if they are at an extrication place where they say it's unsafe to begin patient care, then that might be something you have to acknowledge, and you have to just kind of stand there until it's your turn, which is really weird. If you've encountered any of these on your ride-alongs or your clinical internships, you know that feeling of, I can see the patient, I can talk to the patient sometimes, but I can't yet care for the patient. And that's a very odd place to be in. What you can do is treat life threats. If there's major bleeding, that bleeding needs to be controlled before we begin extrication. If there is, a patient not breathing and we can safely breathe for them, then that would need to be done before we begin extrication. Another big thing is cover the patient. Everyone who's participating in extrication will typically have on personal protective equipment, but sometimes we forget that when we start breaking windows and cutting on metal, that it exposes the patient to an additional risk of harm. And so make sure your patient is covered with a blanket. Make sure your patient is protected before they start breaking glass and cutting on things. That's something to think about here. We're going to talk about the difference between a simple extrication and a complex extrication. That is a test question. We're going to describe your roles pretty extensively. Remember that safety is our first concern. If it's not safe to begin patient care, then we don't begin patient care. So think about that. I'm going to let you look at that. Don't forget that the safety equipment within a vehicle can be a hazard for you. The airbags can deploy after the fact. The battery that's in the vehicle can set a fire. So you also have to be cognizant of your own safety and the people inside the vehicle, that even after the crash, things may become hazardous, like airbags, batteries, seat belts, the smoke that is inside of the vehicle, becoming an inhalation emergency. So be careful about that. And again, test question, airbags can deploy after a collision. There can be a delay, there can be an electrical interruption, some type of failure on the computer side of the car. If you are involved in extrication, even if you are just the caregiver, but not the people extricating, but you're in the car while it's happening, you have to have on personal protective equipment. You cannot be providing patient care in a vehicle that's being cut on and glass busted and jaws of life and all this stuff without personal protective equipment that goes beyond your standard duty uniform. So keep that in mind. That would normally mean eye protection like goggles, a helmet. Typically you would see bunker gear like firefighter gear, or at least a coverall over your uniform to protect you from glass, to protect you from plastic and metal that is sharp and jagged. Here are the 10 phases of extrication. They like to throw this in there. You don't have to memorize this, but do familiarize yourself with how this thing is going to go. And the big conversation here is normally we get access to the patient immediately and we just begin care. But in an extrication emergency, that is not how it's going to go. There needs to be planning and preparation, and everyone needs to come together in a huddle and say, this is what we're going to do. You can't just simply walk up to the patient and begin care like you would have on any other scene. It's a little more calculated, maybe even a little slower, because of that additional calculation that's required in order to extricate patients and, if needed, provide care at the same time, which is a delicate process, which means you're going to be working with a team. We often get on scene And the EMTs and paramedics are immediately in charge because this is a medical patient, and so we're supposedly the subject matter experts, right? So we get on scene and we're used to just taking that scene and doing what we need to do for the patient. Well, this is not that scene. This scene is going to require us to work with capacities that are just as important as the medical side of the event. If we can't get the patient successfully and safely extricated, then we can't properly care for the patient. So there's a big conversation about that in the book, and just realizing the difference between a normal scene and an extrication scene. Remember that you are supposed to be providing life threat care, bleeding control, breathing control, circulation help if possible, if it's safe to do that. So the primary assessment is still in play. Life-saving things are still in play. Law enforcement should be controlling traffic. One of the largest fatality reasons for EMS providers, line of duty deaths, are related to traffic encroaching upon our scenes. So you've got to be cognizant of traffic. That is how we tend to die. Don't get run over on a scene. Tells you what the firefighters are typically doing. There's the preparation. We're going through the 10 phases here. We do a 360 walk around of a scene. You got to always remember that. If you're going to properly care for a patient and take care of a scene, you've got to have a good view of that scene. You can't just get tunneled in on the patient and where the patient is located. You have to look at the scene globally. How many patients are on this scene? Do I have the resources that I need to have right now on the scene? If you're looking at cars that are mangled and bangled and the people are still in those cars, then you need extrication resources. Start calling for extrication resources. If you're seeing more patients than you have providers, you need to start calling for more ambulances. So those are the things that you have to do before you begin care. So you're talking about snack them. Okay, how many patients do I have? And then how do we triage those patients? What resources do I need? I need fire. I need hazmat. I need a special rescue. Maybe the vehicle is down an embankment. Okay, maybe the vehicle is now in water. So these things would call for additional resources that you don't typically find en route to every call. You've got to ensure that they are en route to the call. These are some of those resources that you might need. Okay, so give that a little bit of attention. If patients are entrapped and extrication will be prolonged, that is typically a primary reason to call for air transport. Anytime you have an ejection, anytime you have a significant mechanism of injury involving a motor vehicle, you want to launch air support as early as possible so that you can utilize them most efficiently. If you're in the position of having to wait on scene for the air ambulance, a lot of the time that won't be the best decision for the patient. So how do you defeat that? Time management speaking. You got to call for it from the point of dispatch. The moment you hear negative dispatch information that sounds significant in mechanism, go ahead and launch that resource. If you don't need the resource, you cancel it. There is no penalty for that. If you launch a helicopter 10 times tomorrow and you don't need them a single time that you launched them, there's no penalty for that. Remember that we're advocating on the patient's behalf. I don't care if I get there and the patient's actually fine and they're walking around on scene and they don't need a helicopter, well, then just cancel the helicopter. That's not our business. Okay? Be cognizant of these things. A lot of coordination is going to happen. Anytime you have a hazard scene, we've talked about this, we discussed it as early as last week's lecture. Anytime that you deem the hazard present on scene, it's not your standard scene, there's something extra, then the vehicle should be 500 feet away, parked 500 feet away. We know that the book calls in the general operations for us to be a minimum of 100 feet away. But if you've identified a hazard in that area, then you need to be 500 feet away. That's a test question. You're looking at the terminology hot zone here. You need to get familiar with cold, warm, and hot zone. The hot zone is where the most potential danger exists. The warm zone is where special rescue people would be operating in order to get patients out of the hot zone. In the cold zone is where you would typically find you. That's where you're probably going to be waiting for the warm zone folks to deliver the patient to you safely. Because these things require special teams, typically that means we all stage 1, 2, 3, 4 ambulances, and we wait for the rescue teams to deliver a patient to us or to advise us how to get our patient out of the warm zone and into the cold zone. You need to become familiar with what is the hot zone. If I gave you an incident, you need to be able to pick what the hot zone would be, where the warm zone would be, where the cold zone would be. So if we took a radioactive incident, for example, if there is still a threat to life, anyone operating in that area or existing in that area would be hot zone. We would take people out of that area into the warm zone where you would find decontamination occurring. On a general basis, hot zone is the horrible spot where bad still exists. Warm is where decontamination and extrication exists. And cold is where you have your healthcare providers staging and waiting for patients to be safely cared for. You cannot begin caring for people who present a hazard to the caregivers. They have to be decontaminated. This chapter and this module, and especially the next chapter, focuses on the ideology that the good of the most of us is more important than the good of a few. And that's not something the general public, and probably not something you have ever had to deal with before in your life. In this job, however, you are going to encounter times and events where we are trained to ensure the best outcome for the most people possible. But we cannot save them all. There are times where we cannot save the patient. If the patient is behind live wires, they will stay there. I can't go to that patient because it is not safe to do so. There is a difference in being a hero and being an idiot. If you are insured death, then you got to make a judgment call on whether or not this is the appropriate thing we should be doing. If you're talking about a whole school of children and your loss of life might save all of those children, then I would probably argue that you should be doing your job. But if we're talking about a single response entity where you are surely going to die and not even possibly save the patient, you got to think a little more deeply about that. Triage is going to be talked about a lot here, where we're determining who is sick enough to get the resources that we have available, but who is too sick to no longer get those resources, and we have to allow that to run its course. And again, that's just tough stuff. You don't see a lot. Courtney, it depends what we're talking. This happens multiple times a year, and sometimes it happens multiple times a day, Courtney. One of the events that I have seen recently that has made that talk become more daily is overdoses. We're starting to see, we have been for some time now, going to scenes where 3 or 4 people have overdosed and aren't breathing. You simply can't care for that many people. And so you've got to quickly start the triage process and determine who in those 4 to 5 you can save. And so one of the quickest things that comes to mind for me about how this is a daily thing that we encounter, motor vehicle accidents would be the first one that comes to mind. And right after that would be multiple patients overdosing in the same scene. So that happens way more often than people tend to imagine. In motor vehicle collisions, even when patients aren't extremely hurt, we have to employ triage every single time. If you get caught going to the first patient that you find that's very sick, you are going to tunnel in on that patient, and you will forget to ensure how many patients are on the scene and how much resources do I need to handle them. You can't begin care on any patient until you know the answers to those two questions. So the real answer, Courtney, is we're doing this every single day. As far as the most horrible side of that conversation, how often does that happen? I would say once or twice a day, once or twice a year in a big way. One of the things that immediately comes to mind is the Charleston Nine, both of them, the fire and the shooting. Those were big events where you had more patients than you had providers, and you had to triage those patients quickly and determine who would get the most resources the fastest, who would get transported first, how many ambulances do we have, how many patients do we have. That is what these last chapters are going to discuss. Okay, so 500 feet versus 100 feet, be able to discuss that conversation. Make sure you remember that when vehicles stop from crashing, they're not stable. They could still move and become a risk. Alternative vehicles like battery-powered vehicles. There are even some hydrogen-powered trucks. Thank God they're extremely expensive, and so most people do not have them. But the battery-operated vehicles are becoming very common. So you do need to be aware that that is a process. It is a safety process to deactivate those vehicles, and in some cases, maybe we can't. Maybe we just get away from the vehicle. We get the patient and we get away. So there is a method, typically, of turning these vehicles into a safe vehicle. And the fire department is typically the resource that's responsible for that. So you got to be careful what you cut. Example here, the book says that you tend to not want to cut the orange, grossly fluorescent, hello, don't cut me, I'm a bad place to cut. You don't cut that because that's your power source. This is, again, something that the extrication resource is going to know about and be trained about. So on a general basis, I wouldn't expect you to be trying to find out which wire to cut and which one to not. The big thing to remember is that those crashed vehicles can hurt you. They can catch on fire. They can still operate. They can still move. The airbags can still deploy. So we know generally how to gain access to people. Remember that you want to do the least invasive thing first to the most invasive thing. So don't forget to try the door handle. I can't tell you how many times we've seen people go cutting on cars and busting out windows when nobody tried the door. No one tried the least invasive thing. Always try the least invasive thing. Don't go busting down front doors if you haven't tried to see if it'll open. Okay, so be careful with that. I also want to remind you guys something in my class. I want to have always said this to you. You could go on Google right now and find numerous paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, and even police officers that have lost their life by simply going to the wrong house in the middle of the night. Don't open someone's door and just walk in that door because you're EMS and someone has called 911 and so I'm here because you called me. What if you got the wrong house? This is the United States of America and you're in the South where people feel a conviction to protect their home and their family, and they are almost always armed to the teeth to do that. Almost every American in this country owns a firearm. You cannot forget that people might just kill you thinking that you are an intruder, that you are coming to harm them. They don't necessarily know you. If you ever go on a scene with me, I never stand in the doorway and knock on a door. Deputy Mataskovic in Charleston County lost his life doing that when he banged on a door to serve a call in which they were hunting someone who needed to go to jail. But instead of answering that door, the suspect began firing through it with a high-powered rifle, and he killed that deputy. You don't ever knock on doors while standing in the doorway. You need to stand to the side so that if something bad happens, you at least get the chance to run away or respond in any way. You want to at least have a chance to respond. You're not necessarily going to survive the event, but I want you to at least have a chance to respond to the event. When you check the door and you find it open, I always open the door. I fling it open. I stand on the side and I yell, EMS, paramedics, paramedics. You want to make sure that you've done everything you can do, letting that homeowner know you are help. You are service. You're here as a hero, not an intruder. Again, take some time. Go on Google and look at how many people in our job have lost their life simply getting the house number wrong and going through a door in the middle of the night that you weren't supposed to be in. Okay? Be careful about that, please. Here's some more extrication stuff. All right, simple access versus complex access. So basically, I'm going to solve the test question here by saying if you had to bust anything, if you had to cut anything, if you had to pry anything, it's a complex access. Simple means you unlocked the door and opened it. Simple means you opened the window by raising it up and just walked through the window or crawled through the window. That would be simple. If you had to break something, cut something, pry something, if you were using a tool, then you're a complex access, and that is a test question. There's some examples. Remember that we're working in a team, so they need to know, they being the extricators, need to know what we're doing. We need to know what they're doing. We have to work together, and nobody has fast hands in the cockpit. That's what we say in the helicopter. There are no fast hands. You got to talk to each other. There's got to be movement with a purpose. Doesn't necessarily equal slow movement, but movement with a purpose that everyone is aware of. Termination of the event is when everyone can go home. And I don't know why that's a test question. I think it's pretty common sense, but it is. All right, specialized rescue. Cave, confined space, open areas like, range parks, forests, fields, hunting areas. Diving rescue, that's one of the options. Mountains, slope, collapsed structures, missing people. We've got EMTs and medics on SWAT teams. We've got EMT and medics on these special rescue rope teams, which they go all in on, by the way. Those are another group of crazies that, can teach you how to tie a knot in 732 ways, but they teach it to you as if you didn't know this tomorrow, you might die. And in their line of work, that's true. You got trench rescue. Remember that you're to park 500 feet away from any of these things that's going to keep popping up. You're responding to a trench rescue, and there's a trench. They're going to give you this big description of this crazy scene, which all results in how far away should you be? And the answer is 500 feet. As far as water rescue goes, I don't care how good of a swimmer you think you are, and I don't care how much of a lifeguard you were when you were 19 at the, water park. You do not encounter the water as a paramedic or an EMT unless you're forced to. That is a very purposeful decision. In previous chapters, we talked about reach, throw, row, and go. Go was the last thing on the list. You should try everything in your power to help people who are in the water, whether it be still water or swift moving water, by not going in the water. You don't want to kill yourself. And anytime rescuers enter the water that aren't special rescuers, they tend to lose their life. So be careful with water. On every ambulance, you will find flotation devices, personal flotation devices, and throw ropes, and some type of equipment to try to help you get people out of water without getting in the water. So just keep that in mind, that that is a special thing. Anytime you go to a big scene like that, a bomb, a suspicious package, a trench rescue, you go to the port and someone's hurt somewhere in the port, I want to remind you that every one of these big factories and industrial areas and the cruise ships and the oil ships and 18-wheeler places, all of these places have trained rescue personnel. So you're going to be working with people who specialize in that particular thing. The cruise ship has a doctor, a nurse, a medic, sometimes EMTs. The port has medical providers, fire response, police response. So, make sure you're working with the resources that you have and realizing that there's already probably been a response. If you go to the Cooper River and all of those big factories and chemical plants, they have huge response teams that are trained at very high levels for hazmat response, chemical response, water rescue. So it is likely that they will be responding and attempting to mitigate an emergency, and you will be there as a transport asset, as a treatment asset. So just keep that in mind, that often these places have their own police departments, fire departments, EMS agencies. I think of Boeing. Boeing has its own security. Boeing has its own armed assets. Boeing has its own fire department, its own paramedics. So when you think about these big factories, or even a theme park, I mean, think about Carowinds. They have their own parts of these things. And so if you're going there, you might be staging and waiting for patients to be brought to you. So keep that in mind too. Pay attention to dispatch information and keep your head on a swivel, because information is going to be flowing rapidly. And if you're going to be a great asset to the team, you're going to have to really take that information in from a fire hose. When these big scenes happen, a lot of people are coming and a lot of people are talking. You got to really pay attention. This is a test question. Collapses involve large areas of fallen dirt that may weigh approximately 100 pounds per cubic foot. Don't forget that. Basically, the 100-pound per cubic foot and collapsing dirt. You want to be 500 feet from anything that you think could collapse. Here you go. SWAT team stuff, that's self-explanatory. I'm not going to talk about it. You might find yourself on a entry team. At Dorchester, we have something called Special Rescue Team for active shooters in schools. That's all special stuff, and you'll be trained on that when you go work there, whatever their resource is. And so in some areas, you might be first people through the door. That ain't common, I would say, but it's becoming more common because the data is very clear that when you have an active threat, you have active victims, and the fastest people through the door make the biggest change. So it's not unlikely that you will be teamed up with a group of law enforcement officers. Their job is to kill the bad guy, and your job is to start putting tourniquets and plugging holes as you go through the building. On structure fires, you're going to get sent to every structure fire, and some people are like, why do we go to structure fires? Because when you first get into this, you think that you don't have any water on the ambulance, so why am I going to structure fire? Well, we've got to care for the people. Number one, there might be people harmed by the fire that live there, or neighbors, or whoever was attempting to respond to it in its most acute phase. Those people might be burned or harmed. And the second important thing is we have to hold up for rehab. You need to know what that term means. Rehab, as it relates to special rescue or fire scenes, we are there for the responders. When they're going in and out of these houses wearing 48 pounds of gear, SCBAs, all these special protective mechanisms, that stuff is very harsh on your metabolic rate. It's very harsh on your vital signs. It raises your temperature. It eats up your resources, and it's not uncommon for even fit responders to get dehydrated, get overheated, increase their heart rate beyond its allowances, and run into trouble. We're there for that purpose too. That's called rehab. We're supposed to be handing out water. We're supposed to be making sure that people look good. You're supposed to be scanning the area when these firefighters come out of the building and saying, that guy doesn't look good. Sit down. Sit down. You're not going back inside. You need to be rehabbed. So every agency does that kind of differently, and you'll learn that when you go there as to what equipment is required for standbys on structure fires. How much do we get involved? How much authority do we have? It depends where you are. There are agencies who have complete authority over fire responses as far as someone doesn't get to go back in. And that all comes from how many people are losing their life, not from the actual fire and maybe a building collapsing on them or them getting killed in the structure fire, but them dying from overheating, dehydration, exertion-oriented stroke, and heart attacks. That is killing these people more often than, getting hurt by the actual fire itself. So we've tried to curb that by having a big emphasis on rehabilitation of responders, making sure these people are well hydrated, well taken care of, that they are getting breaks, especially in the hot periods of the year. All right, make sure you're speaking up. Protective equipment will vary depending on the hazards. Which piece of equipment should be used for all patient contacts? That's pretty easy stuff. We're always going to wear our gloves, right? Don't forget to put your gloves on underneath bigger protection. Sometimes we'll have gloves on, fire gloves or turnout gear gloves, because they protect us from glass and jagged edges, but you need to have your blood gloves underneath that. A lot of that stuff, that lawn and garden fire protective stuff, it will not keep out blood completely. So you might need both depending what we're getting into. What is the first phase of extrication? We talked about that, and the answer is prepare. We got to prepare. As you approach an unconscious patient, they're in the wrecked vehicle, you know there's a power line entangled. What do? Pretty easy. We don't begin care. We have to retreat until the power line is dealt with, which, by the way, guys, might take longer than you think, and that's a pretty awkward moment to sit there and wait for someone to make it safe, but we have to. Here's a question that you're going to get coming your way. What happens if you arrive on scene and there are wires down across the car and the patient exits the car? What do? You tell them to stay in the vehicle. That's what you do. Tell them to stay in the vehicle if at all possible. If they can't, because maybe the vehicle is on fire, then they're supposed to run away from the vehicle, staggered, not in a straight line, and you got to kind of judge it and coach them. But the answer is normally get back in the vehicle, because you don't know if them attempting to run away from the vehicle will encounter the danger. So if you see lines, if there are power line issues, the inside of the vehicle is typically safe because of the grounds that the car is in contact with. A two-door passenger car strikes a tree, 50 miles an hour, doors are jammed, driver appears unconscious. Entering the vehicle by breaking the back window is what? Exactly. It's a complex access. Don't get tangled up in these what ifs, okay? Try to answer globally. Since we broke something, it's complex. 30-year-old semi-conscious pinned on steering wheel, badly wrecked. You gain access. The EMT should then what? You have gained access to the patient. You need a primary, and you have to treat any life threats in the primary. So C is the answer. I want to remind you, there are a lot of people involved. You have to be confident and persistent, but also respectful in saying, get me enough access to the patient to do a primary and get primary care done. Then we can continue extrication. You're not going to have anything to extricate if you let an arterial bleed keep bleeding inside that vehicle. So you do have the ability and the right to gain enough safe access to treat the primary findings and then allow extrication to continue if it's safe to do so. While the EMT is in the vehicle assessing the patient, the rescue team should... So we just gained access. We're checking our primary. What should the rescue team be doing? Yeah, A is the most global answer. They should be deciding where the dangers are. How do we get this patient out safely? How do we, if necessary, let care continue? Proper removal of critical injured patients from automobiles include just general care. We've talked about this throughout. Critically injured from automobiles. Smooth, slow, controlled steps. Not a bad answer. B is kind of stupid, and A would typically result in someone getting hurt. So, yeah, continuous, smooth, controlled maneuvers. A man sucked inside a bin, grain silo is trapped. Which of the following rescue teams is most appropriate for him? He's inside of a bin. Confined space. Now, if some of you were thinking high angle rescue because you're familiar with grain silos, you're probably not wrong. Depending on the scenario and where the patient is in the emergency, but on a most global basis, it is a confined space. You respond to wooded area to search for child's been missing for 24 hours. What equipment should you be leaving in the ambulance? Yeah, you can leave the stupid backboard, which is almost true for most scenes. You are dispatched to the scene of a trench collapse. How many feet away should you be? 500 feet away. Okay, let's take a break. 7:10.
You are now muted. You are now unmuted.
Aiden, were there a lot of questions about operations? It should have been just special populations. 90% was operations? Huh. I will have to go pull that quiz. I don't know how that would have happened. Yeah, there were like 10 questions about special pops. Does that mean? Really cute, Courtney. You do try hard and it won't work. Now, there will be a quiz this week. Likely, though, you will have already seen the information. I'm going to go look at that. I don't know how that would have happened, but I'm going to go look. And I will definitely adjust grades and see if... I can't look right now because my screen is shared. And so if I look right now, then obviously that would be a problem. So I will go look after I get done with the lecture and see if the wrong box got checked. That's interesting. I was wondering about some grades, but maybe it ran out of special population questions, so I'll have to actually go look and see how many questions it says are from the populations module. It should not have included operations stuff, so I will go look and I will adjust grades as needed. Thank you for telling me. There were 100 questions on there, and you're saying only 10, about 10 questions were special pop?
That's probably me being dramatic, but most of them were operations.
Okay. Okay, good point. Good point. I will definitely go look at it. Courtney, was it asking like actual triage questions like the patient has these things wrong with them, what would you categorize them as?
It talks there was one like that. Like, what would you label them?
Okay.
Like, what color?
Okay. All right. Yeah, that definitely should not have happened. So I will go look. Thank you guys for bringing it to my attention. All right. Terrorism and disaster response. This chapter has a lot of weird parts. I want you to pay attention to smells and visual cues. If it says that something is associated with fresh cut grass, I would want you to pay attention to that. Or that this particular deadly thing is associated with the smell of almonds, I would want you to pay attention to that. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, you'll see. There's a chart. There's a whole chart with particular common terroristic agents that are associated with smells, sights, sounds, and so pay attention to that. Hold on 2 seconds. All right, so let's get into that a little bit. Hit some of the key notes. Definitions are going to be big in this chapter. One of those definitions being what is a terroristic event or incident, and it's people who want to use fear to make whatever they want happen. It's going to talk about political versions. It's going to talk about religious versions. But basically, the whole point of terrorism is to use fear by either actual accidents, or actual incidents, or proposed incidents to cause what they want to happen. Example, extremists of the Eastern world would like to cause us to be more moral, they think. So they use bombings and car bombs and mass shootings as a way to cause fear in the general public to get what they want. So that's what terrorism is. You need to know that definition. You're going to see that test question. Domestic is here and abroad is elsewhere, and they do shake hands together. You will see a question or two that says an example of an event, and then asks you to group it into which one you think it is: religious, extremist, political, cyber, or single issue. I don't like those questions because oftentimes they overlap. Here's what you need to do though. If it is something political, if it is something religious, but it is only one specific thing about religion or politics, then choose single issue. So again, abortion, for example, is a very political thing. It is a very religious thing, but it is a terroristic event of one specific type. So then choose single issue. You'll understand that later. Or maybe you already have because it was on your quiz. You guys know what active shooters are, so I'm not going to worry about that with you. You know that we go in on these events. We did not used to. We used to stage. From your ride-alongs, you probably know by now that if there is pretty much any threat at all, we stage for law enforcement. You hear us say that all the time. Medic 3 will be staged at blah blah for law enforcement. And law enforcement goes there first, and they assess the scene, they control the scene, and then they say, all right, the scene is now safe, EMS can come in. And then we come in. That's almost always how it works. Not so much on active shooters. We know that the amount of death in an active shooter event goes through the roof for the least amount of response. If you aggressively shadow an active shooter event with heavy armed and medical response, you save lives. In the police world, they say, go to the noise. And in the EMS world, we say, follow the police. Because the noise caused harm and kept moving. They're going to the noise, and we are going to find the harm caused as we go. So in many locations, you're seeing EMS teamed up with law enforcement for these events. So this is what I call big boy, big girl events. We all call ourselves heroes, and we jump at the chance to be on the news, and we get all of these awards for life saving. Well, this is one of those events that tests your intent. Do you actually intend to serve your fellow man in an emergent and unsafe capacity? It doesn't get more real than an active threat causing active harm and us teaming up with law enforcement to try to save lives and kill the bad guy. And so, depending where you work, you might find that to be the case. There are still places in the country that are crazy, and they're just staging EMS. If EMS is 5 blocks over from all the people bleeding out, they will be able to accomplish nothing. One of the most learning events that we've ever had in this is the Pulse nightclub shooting. In the Pulse nightclub shooting, I will not attempt to critique what happened there and say they were wrong or they were right. I will simply tell you that, one, there's a lot of information available for you to read that is not associated with the media and talking heads. There are lots of affidavits and court documents and legal writings that you can read to see what happens in that level of chaos, for the good or for the bad. In the case of the Pulse nightclub shooting, there was an amount of people shot pretty quickly in the first outburst, and then the suspect retreated to a bathroom. But the responding law enforcement agencies and the EMS agencies didn't know that the suspect had retreated to a bathroom. There were people held up in 2 bathrooms, and one of those bathrooms housed the suspect. He, at that time, was no longer a significant threat. However, many people in that club did not get immediate care because of the stage for safety modality. For the good or for the bad, whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision, I don't intend to get into it all. I don't even care. What we do know is that when you team those response agents together safely and train accordingly, you can make a pretty big impact. And so that is what's happening in a lot of areas in our nation. So think about that. I think it's a really great thing that we're hitting that threat head on. Mass destruction, look at the definition of what this is. It's pretty easy, I think, but it has to have the intent to cause mass harm. CBRNE, you need to know exactly what that means. Be nice is another way to say CBRNE, and you need to know exactly what that means. So we're talking about biological, nuclear, incendiary, which means fire, chemical, and explosive, which means boom. You need to know what incendiary is and what explosive is versus each other, because people lump them together and they are not the same. CBRNE is the same stuff, termed differently. Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive warfare. Weapons of mass destruction is what WMD stands for. You need to know that. Vesicant is a blister agent that finds its way on the tests all the time. Metabolic agents are typically chemical asphyxiants. It can be a respiratory agent and a metabolic agent. That kind of gets together. But chlorine might be termed a respiratory agent, not a metabolic agent, because chlorine actually attacks the tissue of the lungs versus cyanide or carbon monoxide actually attacks the ability to carry hemoglobin, oxygenated hemoglobin, and then to get that into the cells and be used by the body. So that's the difference between the two. A respiratory agent would be attacking the lungs themselves, and a metabolic agent would be attacking the ability of oxygen transport and maybe even diffusion at the cellular site. Know what a vesicant is, a blister agent. You got to know that biological means viruses, bacteria, and toxins. We used to say biological is living agents. That's not necessarily true, so we stopped saying it. But it's viruses, bacteria, and toxins. You know what nuclear radiological is? They're called dirty bombs. The Department of Homeland Security, you need to know, is the primary agency that prepares for and responds to terroristic events of CBRNE on the civilian side. There's an entire branch of there's an entire division in the branches of military that deal with CBRNE. That's not really on a test question. Here are what we typically need to know about all big type of calls, but that's what they're specifying for this particular call. Secondary devices is a big talking point in this chapter. What that means is that you have an initial boom that's supposed to cause harm, and then the bigger boom is set away and aside for responders. We know that in the Boston Marathon, for example, there was an attempt at a secondary device incident where you cause one explosion that is leading to all of these people responding in one centralized area, and there will be a second explosion. You got to have your head on a swivel. There is the concept out there of causing greater fear by attacking the response, which has always been an objective of the most extreme militant type attacks. You want to not just take hundreds of thousands of lives, you want to, for the people that are remaining, cause enough fear to gain the result you originally wanted. So it isn't always about the initial boom, and you have to be careful with that. There's going to be test questions on that, being aware of a secondary device type of incident. We already talked about all of that. I'll let you read that. Vesicants on the skin cause blisters. They're going to talk about that in the testing. You've probably already seen it. So, if I were you, I'd make a small, not elaborate, a small little chart, and I would write out what the common vesicants are, what the common nerve agents are, because you don't have many on the EMT side of the learning, so it's an easy thing to do, and you are going to see it in test questions. Here's the positive. These tend to be level 3, level 4 questions, and so if you get a couple of these right, typically they give you credit for that module. So if you are seeing very difficult questions like, is sulfur mustard a vesicant on the National Registry, that's a pretty good sign. It means you're doing pretty well. Okay? The harder that test is, the better you're doing. Okay, you got to keep that in mind. So sulfur mustard is a vesicant. It blisters the skin. So are CX and leucite. Any type of phosgene is going to be a big deal as far as contact with the skin and potential inhalation. Phosphorus-based agents are pretty bad for us, as you probably well know. No antidote for these things, by the way, which is pretty bad. So you have to decontaminate, and the damage is done, And you've got to get that patient to particularly a burn center. Pulmonary agents, these are a little easier because I think most people are more common with them. So chlorine would be a big one. Phosgene, the reason why some of these questions are difficult is because they overlap. And they overlap based on the route. Remember your inhalation, injection, ingestion, and then dermal, okay, exposure by the skin. So they're the same causing agent, but different route. So keep that in mind. Nerve agents that are common are these. So you got to pay attention to this. Again, the ones you aren't familiar with are the ones I would write down. I would write down the vesicants, and I would write down the nerve agents, and just kind of give those a little bit of a look over. Here's your stupid, do you smell this smell? By the way, every hazmat class I've ever taken has always said that by the time you smell something, you are exposed to it. And so it ain't a typical thing to do to go trying to smell what it is that you think could be an exposure. So be careful with that. But just for your knowledge, these have fruity smells. On my tests for the National Registry, for both EMT and for paramedic, I was asked multiple questions about the smell of grass, the smell of fruity things. So these questions do find their way to the National Registry exam. Sarin gas is probably the one that everyone remembers. VX is also on people's radar, but sarin gas is definitely the one that people think about. And it is a vapor hazard, severely lethal. If you paid any attention to sarin gas. Nerve agents, which are typically, what in the world is it doing? There we go. These agents cause sludgeum. We already talked about sludgeum or dumbbells, same thing. And basically, it just means that the body is trying to rid itself by drowning in its own secretions. Salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, diarrhea, drooling, gastric emesis, and dealing with the muscles and the pupils. If you find this, the big antidote is duodote or atropine-based injections. We remember that atropine will dry you up. It's a cholinergic drug, and so it will dry you up and it will suppress the parasympathetic system. So one of your drugs that we talked about in the poison chapter, the toxicology chapter of the medical module, was duodote, which has two drugs in it, atropine and prolidoxamine, and we remember that EMTs can carry that depending where you work. Now, is it common? Arguably not. In the military, it's more common, and it's based on risk. If you have a big area of risk with that, with a nerve agent, then you might have an agency that gives EMTs duodote, which is an auto-injector pen, just like your epinephrine pen. Hold it there for 10 seconds, and it does its job. It's not uncommon for you to need more than one of those, depending what the situation is. I reminded you in the medical module, and I'm going to do it again here, that this isn't only terrorist events. Any place that has fertilizer or carries agents that take care of plants, animals, farming, those can bring about the possibility of phosphorus-based, phosgene-based nerve-type fertilizers and chemical agents. And so this is not just a terrorist thing. You got to think about it in other perspective as well. If you respond to a large nursery, for example, that does a lot of trees and brushery or maybe landscaping, then you might encounter it there. Pest control companies are another thing to think about when it comes to poisons and toxicology and even the same agents that might be used in terroristic events. So, you don't have to have some big terrorist event in order to run into something like this. Here's your duodote. Metabolic agents like cyanide, CK, which is all the same deal associated with the inability to appropriately bring about oxygen onto the cellular level. That's going to be your metabolic agents. Lightheadedness, dizziness, headache, vomiting, same thing with carbon monoxide. If multiple people in the same place are complaining of the same acute symptoms, that has got to be a huge red flag for you. Obviously, the entry of the team needs to be under SCBA. So if you can't put on a closed breathing apparatus, then you don't need to be in there. They either come out to us or they don't get treated until a rescue team arrives. The big one here is smallpox for viruses. Smallpox for viruses. Anthrax for bacteria. Anthrax for bacteria. So smallpox on the virus side, anthrax on the bacteria side. Those are the big ones. There are other ones, but those are the big ones. Botulinum toxin is used to make your face look prettier. And if you're not using it for that purpose, you're trying to kill people. So there's that. Botulinum toxin is produced by bacteria, and it can cause full-blown paralysis and respiratory death. It can be used for headaches. It can be used for hyperhidrosis, which is a cute way of saying I can't quit sweating. It can be used for some other things that I won't mention here in this class that you could find on some type of occupations we won't mention from www.websites. So it has a lot of uses, a lot of which are very interesting since you're injecting a paralysis muscular toxin into your body. So headaches would be a common reason. Funny enough, we do see reactions to botulinum toxin, especially from headaches and especially from dermatological applications like wrinkle control. It can cause what looks like a stroke. So there's that. You would understand that from a history if you got a good sample. They would tell you. I want to tell you so badly what I ran into with botulinum toxin, but I won't do it on this recorded line. We'll have to do it in the classroom. If someone reminds me, I will tell you what an alternative use of botulinum toxin is out there in the world that you might run into one day. Ricin is a neurotoxin that you need to know, so you got to write that one down. You got to think about that one, and it comes from the castor bean. There have been a couple of good movies that have talked about ricin from the castor bean. I can't remember what that movie is with the cute little boy and the girl who get thrown on an island, and they end up having a baby, and they can't get off the island. They're trying to get off the island, and whatever happens, they eventually, towards the end of the movie, get off the island. They kill themselves with castor beans because they thought the other one was dead. I don't even know. The Blue Lagoon. There you go, Alex. So that's a movie about ricin, which comes from the castor bean. You might see a test question that asks you what neurotoxin comes from the castor bean, and the answer is ricin. Ricin is pretty aggressive. It takes almost none of it to kill you. So if you're talking about lethal dose, the amount of dose needed to kill most people, it's a very small dose. Not going to read that to you. Okay, you will see a couple questions about which rays are the worst rays, and the answer is gamma, right? Gamma is really bad. It can go through more stuff, and it's very fast. And so if you're talking about the rays of commonality that are really bad in the nuclear world, gamma. Neutron is really, really bad. It just isn't the commonality. So gamma is the one that you're going to probably see on test questions. Alpha and beta, if you get distance, time, and shielding between you, you're going to be okay. And you need to always remember TDM. We talked about that before. TDM stands for time, distance, and shielding, or TDS in this case. And that's the answer to radiological warfare, or radiological exposure at all, for that matter, because there are more than just warfares in that regard. Let's see the ones I need you to know. Again, incendiary means to start fires, so think of Molotov cocktails, for example. And there are many types. There are even elaborate, expensive, and technologically advanced versions of incendiary devices. If you have been paying attention to the Ukraine war, for example, one of the most successes that they have had, it has been in incendiary devices, homemade incendiary devices against armored machinery. So it's pretty devastating, pretty successful, but easy thing to do. When you think about other terroristic things, the good take home is that they're expensive and require advanced technology and intellect in order to use. Example, making a dirty bomb, making a biological bomb. That takes way more intellect, it takes way more technology, way more money to do than something like an incendiary device. So for that reason, we don't see as much of those types of CBRNE. Thank God. Which type of terrorist group would most likely bomb an abortion clinic? Remember what I said. Yes, single issue, because it was only one thing. The weaponization is what? Very good. How do you turn CBRNE into a bomb or any type of event? You got to weaponize it. And that's what makes it difficult. The Department of thank God, the Department of Homeland Security daily advisory to keep the current terrorist threat level. What does orange indicate? I hate this question, so I'm going to go right on through. It's B, and who cares? High risk. Absolute nonsense. I'm not even going to go. This will make me so mad. So stupid. Useless shit. Bureaucracy. You are dispatched to a bombing along with 15 other ambulances. Upon arrival at the scene, you should stage your ambulance what? Pretty easy. Upwind and uphill. I would be staging at home. A terrorist, I'm just kidding. A terrorist would most likely use a secondary explosive device to do what? Very good. To cause the most fear by killing responders. Everyone thinks of us as heroes. If the heroes die, you've created a lot more fear. When assessing a patient who was exposed to a vesicant, you should expect to encounter what? Yes, blistering. What does sulfur mustard do? We remember that sulfur mustard is a vesicant. Very good. It causes mutations and the structural cellular change. And so you have an immediate loss of function. What is this bad boy? This is sludgium, ladies and gentlemen. Which one of these things are associated with sludgium? Definitely not cyanide, right? Because that's metabolic. B, soman. Soman is a nerve agent. If you were going for D, you weren't dumb. because phosgene-based things also are nerve agents. But if you were looking under the Sludgeum slide and chapter material, soman was one of the 4 or 5 things that were specifically listed there as causing these symptomologies. You respond to a plastic factory where numerous people present with the same symptoms. One of the patients tell you they smelled the almonds before feeling sick. What is most likely the cause here? We know it's not bleach and chlorine because those are the same. So B and D is out. You have sarin and cyanide, and the answer, if you're a firefighter, is ragingly cyanide, cyanide. Everyone knows that cyanide smells like almonds. However, if you're smelling the almonds, you don't have much time to get the hell out. So don't be sitting around smelling the almonds. Factors that have the greatest impact on the severity of radiation include what? Time, distance, and shielding. Time, distance, and shielding. If you can put time, distance, and shielding between you and that, you have a chance to survive the event. All right, guys, that's a lot of material, and this concludes the operations chapter. I'm going to look at that quiz, so don't you worry. You need to make sure you read these chapters. A lot of this information is pretty specific. I know that most of you, I hope, I feel like you read the chapters, but if you don't, make sure you do it for this time, because this is stuff you just don't see or know about or talk about, so make sure you give it your attention. There'll be no discussion board, but there will be a quiz, contrary to Courtney's wishes, but I'll see you Wednesday, not Thursday. I won't have you Thursday. I will be at Wednesday. Any questions for me before we leave? Yep, there's a module exam. This week's module exam is on special populations. I will double check that there are no questions from the operations module. Oh, by the way, for lecture assignments, the last one is minute 151 and 57 seconds at 8:33 p.m. There are a couple of you typing, so I want to make sure I get your questions. Shy, I hope your phone conversation with whoever that was went well. If you want to do open lab, it needs to be from Monday through Friday. It has to be after 6 p.m. You got to call me and let me know you're doing it. And the EMS team needs to be there so that you can get access to the closet. You're fine, you're fine. Just make sure I know that you're there. Make sure I know what you're doing. It has to be a normal business day for the college. It can't be on a weekend. It can't be on breaks. And the EMS team should be there so that it doesn't raise any flags or alarms and scare anybody. You know, people are delicate. All right, good night, everybody. Love you dearly. Be safe.
Good night, Justin. Thank you.
Good night, Ruby.
You are currently the only